Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Mr. Let's back again to talk to you this time about China and its imperial experience, which is going to look a bit different than it has looked in Africa and India. So, where we last left off talking about China was during the Age of Exploration when the Europeans had kind of been in desire for expanding trade routes. They had made their way to the coast of China, starting first with the Portuguese and then coming along next with the British following them. And of course, they weren't the first people to arrive on the Chinese shores, but those are the first Europeans. And China has always had an air of superiority about themselves. They've always had a certain self confidence, and they've always had a skepticism to trading because of the importance of Confucianism in their culture, telling them that merchants don't really do much for the greater good of society other than profit for themselves. So there's kind of this negative attitude towards trade. So what we see there is China being reluctant to trading with the Portuguese and the British. And in this image on the right-hand side of the slide here, you see the Macartney mission, which was a diplomatic mission on behalf of the British being sent to China to meet with the Qianlong Emperor in 1793, presenting this letter from King George and trying to hope to improve trade relations. And you see these 5 or 6 guys off to the right here, bowing like stupidly, humiliatingly low. This is a kowtow, and this is seen as a pretty humiliating thing to do. Like, for instance, imagine if I made you guys kowtow before me in front of class. It would be really weird. It would be uncomfortable. You'd be pretty embarrassed by it. It wouldn't be good for anyone. And so the British have to do this in order to gain these trade relations with the Chinese, and they're not too psyched about doing it. So not only that, the Chinese are going to limit trading and contact for the British and for the Portuguese. For instance, the British can only trade in one city, and that city is Guangzhou, or sometimes you'll see it called Canton, and missionaries are allowed into the country as well. But as we kind of zoom out this image a little bit and look in the larger scheme of things, so you see the Chinese Qianlong Emperor on the left-hand side with kind of his posse, his assistants there. And then you see Lord Macartney, the guy in blue with the red sash, holding this letter, and all these British guys behind him looking like they just raided the North Pole and Santa's workshop for all the toys they could find. They are trying to basically impress the Qianlong Emperor and the Chinese with whatever they can. I mean, my goodness, you see a balloon, you see a chariot on wheels or something, you see a weather vane, of course, you see a rocking horse, a ship. Is that a roulette wheel? Yeah, I think there's a roulette wheel. Badminton toys, like just anything they can throw at the wall, hoping that it will stick and catch the eye of the Qianlong Emperor. And they're doing this because they want to set up trade relations with the Chinese. This letter that Lord Macartney is holding is a letter from the King of England stating his intent to develop these trade relations. But on the left, you see the Chinese just kind of like skeptical, against the idea, very hostile to it, sense of superiority and smugness. And my question for you, and I don't have the answer to it, is do you think the Chinese should be behaving in this manner, this sense of superiority and smugness? I just want you to think about that. So just a quick map, you can see Guangzhou is where the British can trade, Macau where the Portuguese can trade, and that's it in the early part of this trade relationship. So Lord Macartney hands that letter to the Qianlong Emperor, and the Qianlong Emperor pens a letter in reply and hands it back to Lord Macartney for the king. And the Qianlong Emperor says to King George, quote, "As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. Our celestial empire," that's China, "possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which the Celestial Empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted, as a signal mark of favor, that foreign merchant firms be established at Canton, so that your wants might be supplied and your country thus participate in our beneficence. It's really arrogant. And in case you didn't pick up on it, I'm sure you did, let's just recap a few things. We possess all things. I set no value on objects stranger in genius, and I have no use for your country's manufactures. So the first two sentences, we have everything, we don't need any of your stuff. The fourth line, there's therefore no need to import the manufactures, we know that, of outside barbarians. The Qianlong Emperor is calling the British the barbarians. So think back to like imperialism in Africa and the Europeans always viewing the Africans as the uncivilized or the barbaric peoples. And in this relationship, it's kind of the Chinese calling the Europeans the barbarians. So the script has flipped here. But then at the end, kind of like saying, we get it, we're really awesome, and you want all of our stuff, so we'll be the good guys and we'll let you get some of our awesome stuff. That's what we're seeing here. And he's right. The British want it. Look at the silver going from Britain to China. You can see it is in the positive for basically all of the 18th century and even into the early 20th, or into the early 19th century. So the question becomes, is if you're in the shoes of the British, what can they sell to the Chinese in order to stop the dramatic outflow of silver? They have an industrial revolution. They're producing textiles like they never have before. They have weapons that are far superior to what China has to offer. Industrial machinery, China doesn't have that going for itself. No, no, and no. The Chinese just got done saying, we don't have a need for your manufacturers. We don't have any desire for this stuff. And the Chinese, in that point in time and in that moment, they don't view a need to be in this competitive mode where they have to keep up with what's happening in Western Europe. So is it silver they have to keep selling? They'd really rather not. They want that silver coming back from China to Britain. So the answer to the question really is going to be opium. And you see, if I were to have flipped back 2 slides to that chart of silver production, let's do that for a second, or silver shipments, starting in the early 1800s, it goes negative, meaning the silver is now going from China to Britain because, skipping through this, opium is being sold in dramatically higher quantities. Now, you may have forgotten our conversations from early on in this unit about opium. Opium is a highly addictive and powerful drug. And I have kind of some pictures here of what are called opium dens in China, with men typically using the drug. They would be smoking it. And you can kind of see these guys laying around, really lethargic, really out of it, not really doing much of anything productive. And it's the same thing in this picture. So from Livestrong, here's some effects of opium. It says, aside from the relaxed feelings and relief from anxiety, which you saw there, causes decreased alertness, which I think you saw there too, respiratory depression and slow breathing, impaired coordination, nausea and constipation just from smoking it in one sitting. The effects can last from 3 to 6 hours. Here's the interesting part, though. Prolonged use can be the result of smoking the drug, and these users experience extreme dependency. If they stop using the drug, a chemical imbalance begins throughout the body. The addict suffers from withdrawal that starts only a few hours after the last use. During this phase, the person suffers nausea, cramps, fever, weakness, depression, muscle spasms, and anxiety. And the agonizing withdrawal process can last from 7 to 10 days. So we're talking about a drug that really has a powerful addictive property to it that the Chinese are not going to be able to shake. And that's what the British want, because that gets silver sent back to Britain, because the Chinese have to demand this product because so many men are addicted to it. So this trade goes on for quite some time. And finally, in 1839, a commissioner by the name of Lindsay Shu had been appointed by the emperor to address this growing problem. And he writes a letter to the new monarch of England, at that time it's Queen Victoria, and he says, quote, we've heard that in your own country opium is prohibited with the utmost strictness and severity. This is a strong proof that you know full well how hurtful it is to mankind. Since then you do not permit it to injure your own country, You ought not to have the injurious drug transferred to another country, and above all others, how much less to China. Of the products which China exports to your foreign countries, there is not one which is not beneficial to mankind in some shape or other. There are those which serve for food, those which are useful, and those which are calculated for resale, but all are beneficial. Has China, we should like to ask, ever yet sent forth a noxious article from its soil? Basically saying it's illegal in Britain, and China's never sold you stuff that has been so damaging to your people. Why are you doing this to us? Well, we understand this, I think. Why are the Chinese so angered? It's highly addictive. It's causing a decline in productivity amongst working-aged men. It is causing a dependency upon the Chinese that they've never had to deal with before. We've never talked about China relying on outsiders for trade. Outsiders have always come to China because they relied on China for trade. So the British are eventually going to attack the Chinese. Why is that the case? Because China had declared it illegal, but it had still been smuggled into the country. But smugglers, if they were caught, would receive the death sentence. However, this doesn't really get addressed until Lin Shui, that guy who just wrote the letter to Queen Victoria, confiscates a massive shipment and has it destroyed. And the merchants of Britain who are selling the opium on Chinese shores basically appeal to their government and demand Britain takes action in response to this shipment being confiscated and destroyed. And this starts the Opium War. And you see in this image here, and just like the caption tells you, on the left-hand side, you have British warships firing rockets on Chinese junks and destroying them. And this is pretty much what happens with the Opium War. British weaponry, because of the industrialization, because of the intense military competition that has existed in Western Europe for centuries now, means they have far superior weapons than compared to the Chinese. And the Chinese are going to get pretty much destroyed by the British as a result of this Opium War. And what it results in is the signing of what's called the Treaty of Nanjing. That's its official title, but it's going to actually be nicknamed the Unequal Treaty because of how unequally it affects both nations. For the British, it's a really positive treaty. It does a lot of positive things for them in China. But for the Chinese, it disrupts, destroys, and begins to humiliate the country. Britain will get the territory of Hong Kong as basically a trade post for them, and they're able to govern and control it. China is forced to pay the British for the cost of this war that they lost, and the British get what are called extraterritorial rights in China, which means that if you are a Westerner, if you are a British person living in China, you are not subject to Chinese law. You are subject to British law. And if you break the law in China, you are tried in a British court and not in a Chinese court. So this is like, I mean, this is literally foreigners coming to your country saying they don't have to follow your laws. So you can see why we call this the unequal treaty. And the fact of the matter is this is going to be the first of several unequal treaties the Chinese will sign, because other Western nations are going to step in and say, hey, we want the same privileges. Otherwise, we will be willing to do the same thing that the British had done to you in terms of the warfare and the destruction. And it's just not something the Chinese want to be dealing with. So China is extremely humiliated, both the government and the people. And this is going to lead to a rebellious movement within China beginning. And that rebellion, that's called the Taiping Rebellion, is going to be against the Qing dynasty itself. So you can, for all intents and purposes, consider this to be a civil war. This Taiping Rebellion is led by a guy who believes himself to be the younger brother of Jesus, who believes it is his purpose in life to establish a kingdom of heaven on earth, who it is time to severely and heavily reorganize Chinese society, and that begins with destroying the Qing dynasty. And he's going to gain a lot of popularity, especially with the peasantry, so much so that this rebellion is going to last for 14 years and is going to result most likely in the deaths of 20 to 30 million Chinese. So at the end of this, China doesn't come out stronger. They come out even more weakened. And it allows for even more Western involvement and interference in the Chinese system, and we get what are called spheres of influence. Now, down at the bottom of your page, it leaves you a blank spot. The bottom here is the definition of what a sphere of influence is. We've seen this before, but it bears repeating. A sphere of influence is an area that's controlled by foreign nations who are given exclusive trading privileges there. So this multicolored map of China shows you all the different spheres of influence that exist. To the north, you see the Russian sphere of influence. Right here on this kind of peninsula, you see the German sphere of influence. This purple territory here is the British sphere of influence. And then we have the Japanese sphere of influence further to the south, kind of just across from Taiwan. And then down in the furthest southernmost part of the southernmost part of China, you see the French sphere of influence as well. So there's a lot of involvement in this area from European powers. They have not taken over the government. They have simply taken economic control and been granted economic privileges in these various spheres of influence. So, who's missing from that equation? We've got England, we've got Germany, we've got France, we've got Russia, Austria poking around a bit, the Japanese standing off in the background here. Good old Uncle Sam in the background. The US is not in the picture here. And we're not involved early on because we're still kind of wrapping up the effects of the Civil War, and we're in that process of reconstruction. But in the 1890s, we are going to start to push to become more of an imperial power. The problem is with China is those spheres of influence are heavily cemented and established. So what we're going to push for is something called the open door policy, which is exactly what it says below there. It's that all trading nations would have access to Chinese markets equally, and they would allow China to govern itself. So no longer would these spheres of influence really matter. Basically, foreign nations were free to compete throughout China. And all of the imperial powers kind of sort of agree on it, or they don't disagree on it enough to the point of stopping it. But it's soon going to be challenged because we are going to see the emergence of what's called the Boxer Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion, like I said, think of it like a civil war, because the Taiping Rebellion is against the Qing dynasty. The Boxer Rebellion, like it says here, it is a revolt against Westerners in China. So this group called the Boxers, that are technically known as the Righteous, I can't remember, the Righteous and the Righteous and Harmonious, the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. That's what it is. And they believe that these exercises that they do, that seems to be like shadow boxing, allows them to be impervious to bullets, meaning they basically think that they're invincible. And of course they're not. But they're going to target Christian missionaries and the families of those missionaries, as well as Chinese converts to Christianity and some families of foreign diplomats living in China. So this rebellion is against Western influence in China, so it's going to be put down by joint Western forces. A whole group will be assembled from all throughout the world to put down the Boxer Rebellion, and it will be put down. And you can see in this image here, these are kind of the groups of people who come together to fight the Boxers. You see the British, the Americans, the Russians, soldiers from British colonial India will fight, the Germans, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, the Italians, and the Japanese all come together to put down the Boxers. And what ends up happening is it comes to be known that the Boxers were supported by this woman on the right, who is the Empress Dowager Cixi. And she wanted the Boxers to be successful because she didn't want Western influence in her country anymore, but they failed. And so that creates more problems for them. And you're going to start to see a lot of revolutionary movements start to emerge throughout China. And Cixi is going to die. She's going to be replaced by a 3-year-old boy, Pu Yi. It's the little guy you see on the left-hand side there. He's only going to be around for 3 years. He's not killed. He's going to be expelled from the country. He is going to be cast out because by 1911, there's going to be a successful nationalist revolution, which represents the end of all dynastic systems in India. So there's no more Chinese dynasties. and we will see an entirely new era of government, which for now, we're going to kind of leave it at that because that's a whole nother story to tell. So there's more to be said than what we've got here, but that will be covered in class. So hopefully you've got the basics there. You know the deal. Whatever questions you have, talk to me in class. Like I said, just covering the basics here. So there's definitely still a lot more to be explored.